Which prison do you think is the most infamous in America? ADX Florence in Colorado, where El Chapo and convicted terrorists are held? Or San Quentin in Attica, names forever linked to historic violence? But right in New York, just a short helicopter ride from Manhattan, there is another place. Rikers Island. It is not a Supermax, yet it has been a hotbed of gang conflicts, where street rivalries echo behind bars. So among the thousands who have passed through those steel gates, who are the 10 most notorious names? Number 10. Bobby Shmurda, GS9. The visiting room at Rikers carried the smell of rusted iron. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the cold metal chairs. Aquil Pollard, better known by his street name Bobby Shmurda, sat across from his girlfriend. It seemed like a simple moment, just a quick embrace. But soon after, correction officers reported finding a prohibited sharp object. The press seized on the story. To them, it was proof that even New York's most secure jail could not cut off the reach of a gang. Bobby was born in 1994 in Brooklyn. He grew up in East Flatbush, a neighborhood where rap, money, and conflicts often ran side by side. His crew, GS9, also known as G-Stone Crips, was both a music collective and, according to prosecutors, a street organization. When his hit song suddenly exploded on the charts, fans cheered. But investigators were already watching. In December of 2014, after a months-long investigation, officers moved in. Bobby was taken into custody. Authorities reported seizing 21 guns and filed a lengthy indictment alleging conspiracy, weapons charges, and narcotics offenses. At Rikers, fame meant nothing. Bobby spent time in the box, a small solitary cell where every slam of the door felt like a hammer strike. He was written up for fights, for contraband, and for that visit with his girlfriend. The incident added 4 more years to his record, but since it ran at the same time as his 7-year sentence, the actual time did not change. Still, the media frenzy turned it into a bitter spectacle. His name was suddenly in headlines more for scandal than for the song that once put him on top. In 2016, inside a Manhattan courtroom, Bobby accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 4th-degree conspiracy and 2nd-degree weapons possession. He was sentenced to 7 years. Bobby told the court he felt pressured into the deal. Some observers believed he wanted to reduce the time for his friend and fellow GS9 member Rowdy Rebel. Prosecutors responded simply. Their only goal was public safety. And in that courtroom, personal reasons were swept aside, leaving only the cold numbers of the sentence. Years later, in interviews, Bobby described Rikers as a battlefield in miniature. Gang rivalries, contraband flowing in, daily tension that never eased. He talked about time in IPC housing, days locked in 4 white walls, eating cold meals, listening to the hum of fans. Rikers did not care that he had once performed in front of thousands. Inside, he was just another inmate with a number. In February of 2021, the final steel door opened. Bobby walked out, drew a deep breath, and stepped into conditional freedom. Brooklyn welcomed him home. But the shadow of Rikers followed, a stain that remained on his record like spilled ink that never fades. To the community, his story served as a reminder. Fame offers no shield from the law. A hit song can take you to the top, but an indictment can bring you crashing down. Number 9. Rowdy Rebel, GS9. Shots fired before Barclays Center show. That was the bold headline printed in the December 2014 indictment. The name stood out clearly. Chad Marshall, known as Rowdy Rebel. Just hours after gunfire rang out in Borum Hill, Rowdy still appeared on stage at Barclays Center. He was wearing the exact same clothes he had on at the scene. Prosecutors said a firearm recovered at the Millennium Hotel in a room registered to him matched the evidence. To New York, this was not just another rapper. To investigators, it was a living example of how music and street ties could collide. Rowdy was born in 1991 in Brooklyn, raised in East Flatbush. To him, GS9 was family. To law enforcement, it was G-Stone Crips, a group with alleged weapon stashes, cash traps, and coded language to hide communication. When Bobby Shmurda pulled GS9 rap into the spotlight, investigators were already close behind. The number 21 guns, announced in a press conference, became a symbol of the crackdown on GS9. At Rikers, more specifically inside the George Machen Detention Center, Rowdy made phone calls to the outside. His voice was raspy but steady. He said, "It's a waiting process. It's all in God's hands." It sounded tough, but behind it was the fatigue of someone who knew he might sit for years before hearing a verdict. He turned down an initial 8-year plea deal. He talked about making music, about mixtapes, and about waiting for trial. But GMDC was no recording studio. There were steel doors, sudden clashes, and solitary confinement, the box, that every inmate feared. In September of 2016, defense lawyers presented a final offer, a joint plea for Rowdy Bobby and Nicholas McCoy. 4th-degree conspiracy, 2nd-degree weapons possession, maximum of 7 years. No right to appeal. The terms were harsh. If one of them refused, all 3 would lose the deal. Rowdy looked at his crew, then signed. Prosecutors called it a way to stop the cycle of violence. Defense lawyers described it as a chance for Rowdy to one day return to normal life. But at Rikers, it was just another entry in the system. Charges, numbers, and a cold sentence on paper. On December 15, 2020, the gates of Collins Correctional Facility opened. Rowdy walked out after nearly 6 years. He was placed on conditional release until 2025. Brooklyn welcomed him back with raised phones and laughter in the crowd. But the record remained. The Barclays shots, the GMDC phone calls, the 7-year plea. Rowdy smiled faintly, Bernese, the smile of someone who had just slipped out of a trap, but still knew the shadow of Rikers would follow to the end. For the audience, Rowdy Rebel stood as a clear lesson. Rap could take you on stage, but the law would decide when you had to bow your head. Number 8. Tekashi 6ix9ine, Nine Trey Gangsta Bloods, Rikers Island, summer of 2018. Inside the West facility, in a section called the Contagious Disease Unit. It was normally used for inmates with infections. But, that day, it held Daniel Fernandez, known worldwide as Tekashi 6ix9ine. The steel doors were locked tight. No shared yard. No one was allowed to walk past his cell. The New York press called it protective custody. But to other inmates, it was isolation. Because if 6ix9ine were placed in general population, his ties to Nine Trey could make him a target from the very first day. Fernandez was born in 1996 in Brooklyn, raised in poverty. Rap pulled him out of the corner streets but also pulled him into Nine Trey, a branch of the United Blood Nation. That same organization had been born inside Rikers back in 1993. A closed loop. The gang formed on the island, and now one of its most famous faces was locked up at the very place it began. In July of 2018, Fernandez was arrested at JFK Airport on a Texas warrant. A few days later, he entered Rikers. No shared yard. No public phone calls. Even exercise was done alone, under cameras and behind fences. That was the price of being famous, while also linked to Nine Trey. 4 months later, in November, the Southern District of New York unsealed a sweeping RICO indictment. Racketeering, robbery, gunfire incidents. According to prosecutors, 6ix9ine was not just a rapper. He was described as an active participant in street attacks alongside Nine Trey. In January of 2019, Fernandez appeared in court and pleaded guilty to 9 counts. On the stand, he admitted he had paid for a shooting simply to boost his status in Nine Trey. That confession turned the case into a nationwide media storm. To prosecutors, he was proof that a star could use gang affiliation as a shield to build credibility. To the hip-hop world, he became a snitch after cooperating with the FBI to reduce his sentence. He received 24 months. That may sound light, but compared to the 47 years he first faced, it was a dramatic turn. When the COVID pandemic hit, he was even granted home confinement due to documented asthma. But the memory of Rikers remained. In the West facility, where he was locked down like someone carrying contagion, Tekashi 6ix9ine experienced a special kind of isolation, not because of a virus, but because of gang politics. A rapper once proud to shout Treyway on stage, now pushed into segregation by that very name. Number 7. Casanova, Gorilla Stone. In a Manhattan courtroom during the summer of 2023, the number 188 months echoed coldly. Caswell Sr., known to the world as Casanova, stood silent. His shoulders tightened as if bracing for a final note in a song he could not escape. 15 years and 8 months. A federal sentence closed the chapter of a Brooklyn rapper once known for igniting clubs with the track Don't Run. But away from the lights, prosecutors said he was pulled down by the chains of Gorilla Stone. Back in his teenage years, Rikers Island had already been his street classroom. It was there that Casanova met a skinny 16-year-old named Rakeem Myers, later known worldwide as ASAP Rocky. Inside that tense yard, Casanova shielded Rocky from a confrontation. A small story, but one that revealed an early truth. In jail, no one survives alone. Outside, Casanova chose rap, but prosecutors said the ties of the Bloods never released him. Gorilla Stone, a branch of the untouchable Blood Nation, stretched from Harlem to the Bronx and even down into Florida. Court records described discipline, collections, bulk marijuana trafficking, and even schemes tied to COVID relief funds. For Casanova, music and gang life intertwined. One side offered light, the other side carried shadow, and in the end, the shadow won. Federal files read like an indictment without a soundtrack. In 2018 in Manhattan, a robbery was carried out. A victim was assaulted and robbed. Casanova was identified as being present and directing the act. 2 years later, in July of 2020, at a gambling party in Florida, prosecutors said Casanova pulled a gun and fired. One man went down with injuries, and across those years, he allegedly helped coordinate distribution of more than 100 kilograms of marijuana, fueling Gorilla Stone's machine. On December 1, 2020, the Southern District of New York unsealed a sweeping indictment of 18 defendants. Casanova's name was among them. He did not run. He surrendered himself. A move seen as both calculated and as recognition that the law had closed in. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to racketeering, narcotics, and firearms charges. No excuses, only acceptance. Judge Halpern, in handing down the sentence in 2023, stressed that Casanova was a leader, not a follower. 15 years and 8 months was the price for turning fame into a shield, and then using street power to uphold the shadow of Gorilla Stone. After the verdict, some said Casanova feared solitude most of all. A strange fear for someone who once stood before thousands of fans. But that was the paradox of Rikers. The lessons learned in the yard only led him back to the cement box of isolation. The story of Casanova was no ballad. It was the screech of metal doors. From Rikers in his youth to the Manhattan courtroom, a cold line connected both ends of his life. And in between, only one lasting mark. A Brooklyn rapper, a Gorilla Stone leader, and a federal sentence with no forgiveness. Number 6. Jonaiki Martinez-Estrella, Trinitarios, Los Sures, Bronx Supreme Court, May of 2025. Jonaiki Martinez-Estrella listened as the verdict was read again, after 7 years of appeals. 25 years to life for second-degree murder. The appellate court had lowered the top charge, but the time still stretched across a lifetime. 1 month later, news came from Coxsackie Correctional Facility. Martinez-Estrella was found deceased in his cell. A final note in the tragic chain that began on a summer night in 2018. Rewind to June 20th of that year. Security cameras captured a scene that shook New York. A group of Trinitarios dragged 15-year-old Junior Guzman Feliz from a small bodega in Belmont. Multiple cars, multiple blades, a hunt that looked planned. Among the group was Jonaiki from the Los Sures set. Prosecutors said he struck the fatal blow. That one slash ended a young life and etched his own name into New York's criminal record. He was arrested soon after, along with co-defendants. Some were sent directly to Rikers Island, but not into general population. Prison politics were too volatile. According to press reports, 3 suspects were placed in isolation to protect them from other inmates. Rikers was already a pressure cooker. Now it boiled over. In 2019, a jury convicted Martinez-Estrella of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, conspiracy, and gang assault. He was sentenced to life without parole. But the law moves on its own rhythm. In 2024, the appellate court upheld the second-degree murder charge but struck down first-degree, ruling that the evidence did not meet the specific threshold. So, in May of 2025, as the sentence was reset, 25 years to life. For an inmate already in his 30s, it meant spending middle age behind bars. The case of Martinez-Estrella was more than a conviction. It was a portrait of how the Trinitarios operated. Los Sures was not a random crew. It was an organized set, with leaders like Diego Suero and Frederick Then, sending orders and directing members. When a mistaken identity turned into violence, the entire group bore the consequences. Number 5. Diego Suero, Trinitarios ringleader, Bronx, summer of 2018. Inside a modest apartment on the east side, Diego Suero sat among stacks of papers, a phone in his hand. He did not need a knife. He did not need to step into the street. A few calls, a few orders passed down to younger members. That was enough. To the Trinitarios, Suero was an older brother, a man who thought he could create his own laws for the block. But one wrong decision on a June night turned him into a symbol of reckless cruelty. On June 20th, surveillance footage spread like wildfire. A group of Trinitarios dragged 15-year-old Junior Guzman Feliz out of a small bodega in Belmont. A case of mistaken identity. An ambush that became a tragedy. Among those wielding blades were Los Sures members. But behind the curtain, prosecutors said the man calling the shots was Suero. One later told the court Suero was the driving force. He did not swing the weapon, he only flipped the switch. As the footage went viral, the Bronx erupted. The public was outraged. Police launched a manhunt. Within 48 hours, Suero and his right hand, Frederick then, were in custody. Court records revealed that Suero had called a meeting immediately after the incident to handle the fallout. But the plan collapsed. The FBI, the NYPD, and the Bronx District Attorney all converged. From that point, the Trinitarios were no longer a nameless gang in the shadows. In 2019, the trial began. Prosecutors laid out the structure, Suero as the leader, then as the organizer, the Los Shurs crew as the executioners. Testimony, video evidence, and phone data tied the pieces together. In 2022, Suero heard his sentence. 25 years to life for first-degree murder. A self-styled boss, stripped bare in front of the public by the law. At Rikers Island, Suero was not placed in general population. The politics were too dangerous. Anyone linked to Junior's case was a target for retaliation. He sat in isolation. No network, no role. From a man who once thought he could act like a mafia boss, he became an inmate waiting as time eroded his years. The story of Suero was not just another case. It was the collapse of a group that called itself family, destroyed by one foolish order. The Trinitarios had been portrayed as disciplined, with branches and leaders. But Junior's case exposed them as senseless violence, an organization unmasked before the public. Today, Diego Suero remains behind bars. 25 years hanging over him. No Bronx apartment. No phone. No crew waiting for orders, only a name tied forever to tragedy. A so-called ringleader who imagined himself a don but was buried by one reckless decision on a Bronx summer night. Number 4. Antonio King Tone Fernandez, Latin Kings. Manhattan, late 1990s. The press called Antonio King Tone Fernandez a new face trying to turn the Latin Kings into a community movement. But court records told a different story. In 1996, he spent 8.5 months at Rikers for a probation violation tied to a firearms case. The conviction was later overturned after a judge raised doubts that evidence had been planted. For Tone, those months on the island were a harsh lesson. The prison yard was not just steel bars, it was daily clashes between Bloods and Latin Kings, and the rules of survival forced him to grow harder. Once out, Tone wore suits and ties, stepping into community meetings. He spoke about reforming the Latin Kings into a political movement. He organized gatherings known as universals, collected dues, and built ranks like a party structure. The media called him an activist, but in parallel, prosecutors said the New York Bloodline faction of the Latin Kings was still profiting from heroin, cocaine, and enforcing strict discipline. In 1997, Operation Crown struck. NYPD, FBI, and DEA agents raided in unison. Meetings were bugged. Associates were arrested. Fernandez escaped immediate charges, but the circle closed quickly. In January of 1999, he pleaded guilty in Brooklyn federal court to conspiring to traffic heroin and cocaine. Prosecutors called out the contradiction. A man who once spoke of activism was now negotiating drug deals. By June of that year, the sentence was set. 12.5 years in federal prison. Weeks earlier, the Associated Press headline summed it up. Gang leader who sought to recast the Latin Kings pleads guilty. One line captured both sides, the public face of reform and the hidden engine of drug money. Inside prison, Tone no longer had microphones or tailored suits. He was a federal inmate serving a long term. The aura of reformer stripped away. At Rikers, where he had once been held, the Latin Kings and Bloods continued their battles in prison politics. But for Tone, the game had moved on. No more Bronx streets. No more community rallies. Only slow passing years. In 2007, HBO released Latin Kings, a street gang story. The film portrayed King Tone as both a political figure and a failed rebrand. It reminded the public that no matter the speeches, the Latin Kings of that era remained tied to drugs and violence. Antonio King Tone Fernandez entered New York gang history not only as a leader of the Bloodline, but also as its greatest contradiction, a man who wanted to be a community leader, but was sentenced as a drug trafficker. For Rikers Island, his name added just one note. He had sat there. He had learned the lesson, that the island was often just the gateway to even longer sentences. Number 3. Leonard Deadeye McKenzie, United Blood Nation co-founder. New York, 1993. Inside a damp cell at Rikers, Leonard Deadeye McKenzie and Omar O.G. Mac Portee whispered about a shared vision. They believed there had to be a nation strong enough to counter the dominance of the Latin kings and the Netas. Their handshake needed no ceremony, but it was enough to give birth to the United Blood Nation, a prison alliance created behind bars that soon spread back into the streets. At first, UBN was built as a shield, a prison-born nation uniting sets under one color: red, Nine Trey, G-Shine, sex, money, murder. The logic was simple: unite or be crushed. As co-founders, Deadeye was not the loud voice in the media, but on the tiers he was the force who imposed rules and discipline, shaping the alliance into something organized. Prison politics at Rikers were boiling. Latino groups held the majority, controlling commissary, phones, even passageways. UBN quickly became the counterweight. Instead of scattered crews, Bloods united into one structure, divided by sets, but bound by the same law. And when a member was released, the Rikers rules followed him into the Bronx, Harlem, and Newark. That was how UBN broke through the concrete and planted roots in the neighborhoods. Within this structure, McKenzie was one of the first elder figures, a voice heavy enough to set the foundation. Law enforcement documents later described Deadeye and OG Mac as the architects of UBN. Not flashy bosses, but men in the yard whose nods or frowns could determine outcomes. As UBN grew, the Nine Trey set became the most infamous, drawing waves of violence. Yet the origin was always repeated: Rikers, 1993, Deadeye, and OG Mac. Authorities pointed to it as the textbook case of a prison-born gang, born inside the facility and matured outside. By the mid-2000s, major takedowns, from Operation 9 Connect in New Jersey to RICO cases in New York, all traced back to that founding moment. Today, Leonard Deadeye McKenzie is rarely mentioned in the press compared to rappers tied to Nine Trey or recent federal indictments. But within Department of Correction and FBI files, his name is a milestone. A co-founder who turned clashes inside Rikers into a nation that spread up and down the East Coast. And for that reason, Deadeye remains a part of why Rikers is infamous. Not only as a jail that held criminals, but as a place that produced an entire generation of gangs. Number 2. Peter Pistol Pete Rollack, Sex, Money, Murder, United Blood Nation, New York, early 2000s. In a federal courtroom, the name Pistol Pete was read aloud in a thick indictment. But the story began in the Bronx before Sex, Money, Murder was recognized as a branch of UBN inside Rikers. Peter Rollack, a kid from Soundview with eyes like cold steel, was the one who transformed a chaotic street crew into a disciplined organization called Sex, Money, Murder. On the Rikers yard, when the Latin Kings and Netas dominated, Rollack crossed paths with United Blood Nation leaders. Short talks, silent signals, whispered agreements in dark corners, all leading to a turning point. SMM was officially sanctioned as part of UBN. From then on, Rikers rules followed SMM soldiers back to the Bronx. Rollack was no petty hustler. He built SMM like a machine, with ranks, discipline, and profits flowing from crack cocaine and extortion. In the Bronx, the name Pistol Pete hung like a suspended sentence over rivals. Later, the FBI described him as one of the most violent and uncompromising figures ever to emerge from the Bloods. To his crew, Pete was both a mentor and a nightmare, known for not letting betrayal live long. In 1998, the walls closed in. Rollack was arrested along with numerous SMM members in a sweeping RICO case. Federal files stacked high: conspiracy, murder for hire, racketeering. New York headlines read, "SMM leader faces life." In court, witnesses testified nervously about deadly attacks. Even a Rikers officer once admitted, "In the yard, the name Pete always made inmates cautious, avoiding direct confrontations." The outcome was inevitable. Rollack received life without parole. The court described him as a man responsible for waves of violence stretching from the Bronx to Rikers. When he left the island, he did not return to the Bronx. He went straight into the federal system, locked away as a blood-stained legacy of the 1990s. Today, the name Pistol Pete still lingers in Bronx memory. For many former Rikers inmates, he stands as proof of a harsh truth. A prison yard could give birth to a criminal network of massive scale. For the law, life without parole was the final answer. And for Rikers, Rollack left a lasting mark. The island had once legitimized sex, money, murder, and it had once held a Bronx kid whose name would forever be tied to notoriety and violence. Number 1. Luis Felipe, King Blood, Latin Kings. In February of 1997, inside a Manhattan courtroom, Judge John S. Martin Jr. struck the gavel on one of the harshest sentences ever handed down: a life in prison plus 45 years with extraordinary conditions. Luis Felipe, known as King Blood, was not only imprisoned, but stripped of nearly all human contact. No phone calls, no letters to associates. Every word to the outside world limited to a few minutes with his lawyer under strict monitoring. The judge stated clearly, "You have forfeited your right to touch another human being." For an inmate, that was a punishment heavier than chains. Rewind to the mid-1980s. Felipe arrived in the United States during the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. He lived in New York, but soon ended up at Collins Correctional Facility. In 1986, from inside his cell, he began writing the first pages of a dark constitution, the Latin King's Bloodline. What began as a loose group of marginalized Latino inmates grew into a nation with a constitution, ranks, and doctrine. When he was transferred to Attica, he continued to command through handwritten notes. Each coded directive carried weight, turning into acts of violence on the street. Those very letters later sealed his fate. Prosecutors presented more than 60 of them in court, with blunt orders such as terminate on sight. According to authorities, multiple homicides in the Bronx, Harlem, and even at Rikers carried the imprint of King Blood's handwriting. To his followers, he was Inca, the supreme crown. To law enforcement, he was proof that a prison could give birth to an empire. Felipe's influence extended into Rikers Island itself. His rules seeped into the pods where Latin kings clashed daily with Bloods and Netas. When Antonio King Tone Fernandez sat inside Rikers in 1996, it was Felipe's directives that shaped how King Tone later led on the outside. In other words, Felipe never physically controlled the Rikers yard, yet his shadow hovered over its steel corridors. In 1996, a federal jury convicted Felipe in a historic RICO case. The following year, the life sentence plus 45 years was imposed, paired with restrictions rarely seen in the federal system. By 1998, the appeals court upheld it, declaring he would not be allowed even a thread of freedom to command the Latin kings again. Felipe was sent directly to ADX Florence, the nation's Supermax, where every sound is smothered by layers of steel and concrete. Today, inside a 2-by-3-meter concrete cell in Colorado, King Blood sits silently 23 hours a day. No letters, no manifestos, no followers waiting for orders, but his dark legacy remains. The Latin kings in Rikers, the Bronx, and across New York still operate on the foundations he wrote nearly 40 years ago, from behind prison walls.